Hello, everybody. This is James Quick, Microsoft Technical Evangelist here in South Florida. On the screen right now, you can see my contact information. So, my Twitter handle is at jquickwit. My Microsoft email is jaquick@microsoft.com. And then the local meetup is the Miami Fort Lauderdale Windows App Developers. And as you can probably guess from the title on the screen, today I'm going to be talking about the Rotten Tomatoes API. If you followed my series on data binding, I mentioned and worked with the Rotten Tomatoes API a little bit, but didn't really go into any detail and probably didn't do it justice. So I'm here to do a video to get a little more detailed with that API does. So let me pop over to first off the Rotten Tomatoes website. So what is Rotten Tomatoes? RottenTomatoes.com provides you with a bunch of information, kind of a go-to resource for information on movies and DVDs and stuff that's on TV, as well as reviews for each one. So, as you can kind of see over here on the left, they've got different percentages for how, what percentage of people rate them highly or recommend them. So, that's kind of what they pride themselves on. So, at the top here, I think I kind of mentioned this. You have different categories. So, movies, DVD, and TV. The two I'm going to focus on really are movies and DVDs. So getting back a list of DVDs that are new rentals, top rentals coming soon, and then similarly with movies, what's opening in the box office, what's in the box office, what's coming soon, that sort of stuff. So information about movies is really what we're talking about. So the Rotten Tomatoes API to get started. Let me go to the documentation. Let me go to the developer .rottentomatoes.com. So this is the home developer website for the Rotten Tomatoes API. And you do have to register to be able to use it. So there's a register button down here. You have to create a login, username, password, and an email. And down here at the bottom, you're going to have to register a new application. So anytime you want to make calls to their API, you have to include an API key that they give you that's associated with an application that you register with them. So that's kind of your way of authenticating your request to them. And without that key, your request will be rejected basically. So this is required to be able to access the API, but well worth it. So some pretty simple stuff there. Name of your application, application URL. That could be really any URL. And then estimated amount of unique visitors, monthly page view, what kind of application you got, simple stuff. And once you do that, oh, and one thing to note down here at the bottom is you will be limited to 5 calls per second and 10,000 calls per day. So there is that limitation, but you do have probably a while before you reach that, depending on how successful your application is. So it can handle a lot, but it's not. You don't have infinite amounts of calls. So I'm already registered. So let me sign into my account here. All right, so you can see I have up here 2 keys for different applications. But what I'm going to do now is go over to the documentation. And the first thing I want us to take a look at is the IO docs. And the IO docs, from that little link there, will take you to this website where you can click on one of these different kinds of categories and actually make a call to the API. So let's start with box office. So the 2 parameters are the limit, the number of movies we want returned, and then the country code. So if I click try it, it has my application key up here, and then it will form a request URI, this one here, and give me the response, and then more importantly the response body, which is where all the details of the different movies that were returned in that list are where they are. So this is a great way to explore these different kind of calls and have Rotten Tomatoes form that URI for you. Great place to get started, but let's go pop over back to the documentation. Now, the base URI for any calls that you're going to make is this right here. So it's api.rottentomatoes.com/API/public and then v1.0. So that's the base URI that you're going to use. And then from there, you can tack on what kind of call you want to make. So let me come back over to the box office call. And from the V1.0, this is the base. After that, I have lists, and then movies, and then box office. So what I'm saying is I want a list of movies that are in the box office. And it's going to be the same or similar. So if I run the in theaters call, it'll be very similar. Instead of box office, it'll just say in theaters. Yep, so right here it says in theaters instead of box office. And then you have, it's .json, so it's returning a JSON response. And then you have your parameters, so the limit equals 16, the country equals US, and then the API key, which again you're going to have to register for, is tacked onto the end for authentication. So some pretty good stuff there. The intro here, a quick dive into the API, is basically what it says, a quick dive. So it's not going to get too deep, but we'll give you enough to get started. And then these IO docs are pretty helpful for having them create those URIs for you and make the request and show you what the response body looks like. I'm going to copy over this request URI so we can get into what the actual object looks like that is returned. I'm going to go to JSON to C#.com, and this allows you to put in any URL or JSON, and from there, if I click generate, this website's going to actually generate the corresponding C# class for that object that's returned. And this is a great way to look at and understand how the data that's returned from your API call is organized, how it's structured. So let me scroll all the way down to the bottom and start with this root object. So that's the root object that you're going to get back. That root object, most importantly, will have a list of movie objects called movies. And we'll talk about that movie object in a second. And then it's got a couple of extra things, some links, and a link template. Not really that important right now. So let's focus on this list of movie objects. So this movie object is defined up here, and you can see that each movie object has an ID, a title, a year, rating, runtime, synopsis, some posters, some images you can look at, a bunch of good stuff there. So that in itself is a lot of information that you could leverage from the API and kind of put on your application. So let's take a look at some of the objects in here. First off is the ratings object. So you have a ratings object, which is defined above. So right here, and each one of those ratings objects will have a critic's rating, it's a string, then a critic score, integer, then the same thing for audience. So audience rating and audience score. So some good stuff if you want to show some ratings about the specific movie. There's also a posters object defined up here, which just has strings for different kind of images that you can get back. So you can get back, theoretically, a thumbnail, a profile, a detailed, and an original. Let me kind of add on to that, clarify that a little bit, because the Rotten Tomatoes API is now not supporting high def images directly through the API. So if I go to my API call that I made earlier in the IO docs and come down to the posters right here, I figured out recently that even though I'm asking for an original image, a high-res image, it's returning this thumbnail image. So it's returning the tmb.jpg. So let me copy this out and go to another page. And this should be a high-res image, but again, it's returning this TMB. So I could manually change this to ORI, which is original, and there's the image. But they don't directly give that back to you in the API. So all these poster links are going to be the thumbnail images that are returned. So just keep that in mind if you work with the posters and get a little confused about that. So that's the posters object. We also have a list of abridged cast. So abridged cast is defined up here, name, ID, and a list of characters. And And then we have a links object, which is pretty useful. So this adds links to that movie itself, its cast, its reviews, and then similar movies. So some pretty good links that you can use as well. You can get more into and really go through each individual piece of this data that's coming back to you. But what's most important is that the root object, this root object, is going to have this list of movies, and then that list of movies, each one of those movie objects up here, is where you're going to find the majority of all the data information that you're going to be looking for related to that movie. Really, all of the information for those movies is going to be in that movie, the list of movie objects. So that's where you're going to want to focus, and you can play around with this more. JSON to C# is a great reference here to kind of show you how this data is organized, just starting with the root object and kind of going down from there to seeing how these different data objects are nested and how they work together. So just as a quick example, if you had one of these root objects and it was called Rotten Tomatoes, if it was called RT, just Rotten Tomatoes or RT, to access the movies, you could do rt.movies, and then to access the title of one of those, you could do you could iterate through the list of movie objects and then get the individual fields and stuff out of those movie objects in the movies list. So that's how you'd go about doing it, and that's the a little more detailed introduction to the Rotten Tomatoes API. Hopefully that helps, and I will be following up with this on doing some REST API inclusion into projects created in App Studio. So stay tuned for that, and thanks for listening.